She looked me dead in the eye, no tears, no confusion, no hesitation. Just that cold, dismissive tone I'd grown familiar with in the past few years. "Dad, you're not invited. Go away." My fingers tightened slightly around the wrapped box I was holding. A modest gift. Not expensive, not dramatic. Just something personal. Something I thought would mean something to her. I didn't say a word. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I already knew what would happen next. It wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be public. It wouldn't be today. But it would be complete. And it would start the moment I turned my back and walked away from my only daughter's wedding. You may be wondering how a father ends up uninvited to his own daughter's wedding, especially when he paid for everything. Yes, everything. The venue, the catering, the band, the dress, the invitations, the flowers, even the lace on the veil she wore when she told me to get out. But if you think this is a story of an ungrateful daughter, you're only seeing half the picture. This is a story about timing, about choices made quietly over years, about betrayal that doesn't show itself until you're standing in front of 200 strangers and someone you raised looks through you like you're nothing more than an interruption. It's also a story about consequences, set in motion not with anger or revenge, but with silence, paperwork, and perfect timing. You're going to want to hear how this ends, because 2 hours after I walked out of that wedding hall, everything collapsed. Now let's go back to the beginning. I wasn't always a man who could fund an entire wedding without blinking. I built myself brick by brick. Years of sweat, sacrifice, and strategic silence. My name is Thomas Graves. I own 3 logistics companies that operate across the state and into the tri-state area. Not flashy work, but dependable. The kind of business that makes millionaires slowly. I wasn't born into money. I earned it quietly. And every dollar I made with one goal in mind: to give my daughter, Samantha, the life I never had. When Samantha was 6, her mother and I divorced. Linda was difficult, controlling, beautiful in the way that makes men forget how sharp her tongue is. I won't blame her for everything that came after. That would be too easy. But she planted the seeds and I watched them grow. She had full custody, of course. The courts almost always side with the mother unless you have something big to fight with. I didn't want to drag Samantha through court battles, so I paid the support. I showed up on time. I stayed quiet when Linda changed the weekend plans or whispered poison into Samantha's ears. Over the years, I saw my daughter less and less. First it was school events I wasn't told about. Then birthdays I wasn't invited to. Then phone calls that stopped mid-sentence. Eventually, even my Christmas gifts came back unopened. Still, I kept sending them. Still, I kept a college fund for her. Still, I paid. Because fathers don't stop being fathers just because someone else changes the rules. Samantha graduated with honors. She didn't invite me to the ceremony. I watched the live stream with a glass of whiskey in my hand. I clapped when she got her diploma. She never looked into the camera once. But I kept paying. She got her master's degree. I paid for that too. She got an apartment in the city. I quietly helped her with the down payment through a real estate contact. She never knew. I never asked for thanks. I just watched her life move further and further away from me, and I tried to convince myself that being invisible was part of being a good father. That someday she'd see the full picture. Then came the engagement. I heard about it from a friend of a friend who saw the announcement on social media. There she was, Samantha Graves, smiling next to Ethan Ward.
Handsomer Mann.
Clean cut. Real estate consultant. Flashy suit, white teeth. Too smooth. I stared at the post for 10 minutes, reading the caption over and over again. Can't wait to start forever with you. No mention of family. No mention of her parents. Just a list of sponsors and a tag to the wedding planner. I sent her a message. Congratulations, sweetheart. If there's anything you need, anything at all, just say the word. I'd be happy to help. She didn't reply, but someone else did. Her wedding planner. Her name was Avery. Professional. Efficient. I recognized the firm immediately. High-end, discreet, used by a lot of public figures. Mr. Graves. I'm reaching out on behalf of Samantha and Ethan. They've decided to accept your offer to assist financially. Please find the proposed vendor list and associated costs below. That was the first crack in the mask. Because no matter how distant she'd become, Samantha still accepted my help, so long as she didn't have to thank me for it directly. I agreed. No conditions. No requests. I wired the first payment the next morning. But I also did something else. I added a clause. It wasn't sinister. It wasn't even hidden. Just standard legal language. The payments would be managed through a revocable trust in my name, with access conditional on final approvals. I wanted oversight, not control, not sabotage, just a seat at the table, quiet, invisible in the background. Samantha would never know, but I'd be watching. For the next 6 months, I watched the wedding unfold like a production. Venue, $38,000. Dress, $12,000. Catering, $24,000. Flowers, $9,000. Band, lighting, rentals, bar, another $30,000. Everything first class. Everything perfect. Every payment signed off by me, processed through the trust. Silent approval after silent approval. And still not a word from Samantha, until the invitation list came out, and my name wasn't on it. At first, I thought it was a mistake, surely an oversight, so I reached out again, just checking in. Didn't see my name on the RSVP list. Let me know if there's another set going out. No reply, then a text. From Linda. You've done enough. Don't ruin this for her. That was all it said. I stared at that message for a long time. My thumb hovered over the screen. I could have replied. I could have demanded answers, threatened to cut off the funds. But instead, I said nothing. I signed the last check the following morning. And I made a phone call to a lawyer I'd worked with for years, a man who understood quiet power. I gave him instructions. He nodded. Everything was set. The day of the wedding came. I dressed in a simple charcoal suit. Not flashy. Not attention-seeking. I brought a small box with me. Inside was a silver bracelet, engraved on the inside, for every year I missed. Dad. I arrived early, parked 2 blocks away, walked slowly like a guest. I knew I wasn't welcome, but I had to see it. The venue was beautiful. Warm lights, live music drifting through the air. Guests laughing, clinking glasses. Samantha looked stunning. Her smile was practiced but radiant. I waited until just before the ceremony. Then I stepped inside. That's when she saw me. And that's when she said it. Dad, you're not invited. Go away. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She just dismissed me like a stranger who had wandered in from the street. Linda stood behind her, arms crossed, satisfied. I didn't argue. I didn't even blink. I just nodded and walked away. 2 hours later, the music stopped. The food service ended. The lights dimmed. The payments, every single one, were canceled. And that was just the beginning. I didn't build an empire. That would be too glamorous a word for what I made. Empires crumble under their own ego. I built something sturdier, something duller, something that didn't need a spotlight. I built reliability. In a world full of noise, that's what people pay for. Consistency, silence, and results that speak for themselves. 29 years ago, I started with a single truck, 1 contract, and a promise I couldn't afford to break. Graves Logistics started in a garage behind my 1-bedroom apartment. I loaded pallets by hand, drove overnight routes myself, and negotiated delivery windows like my life depended on them, because it did. Every missed shipment was a lost mouthful for a child that barely knew how to say, Dada. Back then, Samantha was just a baby with wild curls and a giggle that could disarm a firing squad. Those were the years of sleepless nights and black coffee and hoping the transmission wouldn't fall apart before the check cleared. And yet, even in the chaos, I remember her fingers wrapping around mine like I was her entire world. Back then, I still was. Linda never liked the business. Too blue-collar, too uncertain, too much sweat and not enough applause. She liked things that looked good. Designer bags, sharp kitchen countertops, curated Instagram smiles, before Instagram even existed. At first, we worked as a team. Or at least we pretended well. She managed the front, the image, the conversations, the social ties. I stayed in the trenches, building routes, hiring drivers, pulling 80-hour weeks so she wouldn't have to pull a single shift. But people like Linda don't stay long in the trenches. They don't like dirt under their nails. She started staying out late. Said she needed space. That I was too obsessed with work. But I thought I was building something for all of us. Until one morning, she served me divorce papers with lemon in her tea. I'll never forget what she said. I need someone who's present, not just useful. The words stung less than they should have, because I had seen it coming for a year. I just hadn't stopped her. I thought if I kept providing, it would be enough. That love was a ledger, and if I added enough to the credit side, the balance would hold. I was wrong. She took Samantha with her. And suddenly, I found myself living in a house that echoed and learning how to divide time into court-approved increments. Weekends, holidays, half-birthdays, no more lullabies, no more Saturday cartoons in pajamas. Just a silence I had to fill with work. So I built more, expanded routes, opened a second location, bought more trucks, and every time I signed a new contract, I thought of Samantha. Because one day she'd grow up. One day, she'd see that her father didn't disappear. He just dug deep so she'd never have to know the fear of the bottom. I never fought for full custody. Linda would have bled me dry in court. And I didn't want Samantha dragged through a tug-of-war just because her parents couldn't stand to lose. So I settled for time. For tiny windows of connection. I became an expert in making the most out of hours. Every visit I'd have something new. A science kit, a weekend trip, a story about a truck with a flat tire and how her dad saved the day. She loved those stories when she was little. She used to think I was a superhero. For a while, she even told her friends at school that her dad drove secret missions at night and delivered important government cargo. And I let her believe it, because maybe in her mind I was still the good guy. But kids grow up, and parents, especially fathers who lose the PR war, start to fade from the narrative. Linda was subtle, smart. She never bashed me openly. That would have made her the villain. No, she planted doubt instead. He's always working. He didn't show up last week because something else was more important. He has a new girlfriend now. Guess you're not his top priority. I could see the change in Samantha over the years. Her eyes stopped lighting up when she saw me. Her hugs got shorter. The questions faded. Soon, she stopped calling altogether. At first, I tried harder. I showed up to school events without an invitation, stood in the back of auditoriums just to watch her play the violin or walk across a stage. But eventually, even that started to feel like trespassing. So I stepped back. Not out of anger, but out of respect. You can't force someone to see you. All you can do is keep the porch light on and hope they'll come home. But I didn't give up. I kept the account in her name, the one that slowly filled over time, the college fund, the savings for a car, the emergency reserves. I managed it all quietly, never letting her know where the money came from. Her name was on every check. Mine never was, because this wasn't about credit. It was about giving her a ladder high enough to climb wherever she wanted. That was the promise I made myself when she was born. I wasn't going to be her anchor. I was going to be her launch pad. I just never expected that once she reached the top, she'd pretend I didn't exist. The first real break happened when she turned 21. She had a party. Not some casual hangout, but a full-fledged rooftop gathering, DJ, lights, catered buffet. Linda was there, smiling for every camera. I wasn't invited. I found out from an old friend of mine who recognized her from Facebook. She looked just like you, he said. But you weren't in any of the photos. No, I wasn't. And that was the first night I ever cried over my daughter. I still remember how stupid I felt. Sitting alone in my office, watching her dance on a stranger's iPhone screen, while I poured whiskey into a glass and tried to convince myself that it was just a phase, that she'd grow out of it. But she didn't. The more successful she became, the further I faded. Until one day she didn't just ignore me. She deleted me, blocked numbers,
No responses.
Birthday cards sent back with return to sender scrawled in rushed handwriting. And yet I kept paying. Because love doesn't come with a return policy. It just comes with terms you learn the hard way. But even then, even with all the silence and coldness, I still saw glimpses of her that reminded me of that curly-haired girl who thought her dad was a superhero. Her ambition, her drive, her perfectionism, all of that came from me, and that meant she hadn't erased me entirely. She was just in denial. So when I heard about the wedding, something inside me stirred again. This was it. This was the big day. The kind of day that reshaped relationships, that softened old wounds. Surely she'd reach out. A call, a text, a single word. But nothing came. Not until Avery, the planner, sent me the first invoice. And when she did, I realized I had one last chance to get it right. To give Samantha the gift I'd always wanted to give her. Not just a wedding, but stability, peace, and love that didn't flinch when it was rejected. So I paid. And then I started watching and waiting, because sometimes being a father isn't about being seen. It's about building the wall someone else leans on until they forget who built them in the first place. But when those walls crack, when the foundation starts to tremble, that's when the silent architect is remembered. And remembered I would be, one way or another. It didn't start with shouting. There were no fights in front of Samantha. No custody battles with judges slamming gavels. No screaming matches over who got her for the holidays. Linda was too smart for that. She played a different game. One made of gentle nudges, emotional guilt, and careful omissions that rewrote entire chapters of history without ever saying anything explicitly untrue. And the worst part? It worked. I began noticing it in the smallest ways. Samantha used to run to me when I picked her up for the weekend. She'd hug my leg before I even had the door open. By the time she was 7, she was waiting with her arms crossed, her smile dulled into something polite, as if she were greeting a distant uncle, not her father. She'd still come with me, still get in the truck. But something was off. The excitement had been replaced with silence. Questions were shorter. Her stories from school were filtered, as if she was unsure what she was allowed to share. I tried asking. I tried gently probing without pushing. How was your week, kiddo? Fine. What did you and Mom do? Stuff. Anything exciting at school? Not really. Sometimes, she'd glance out the window mid-answer. Not defiant, just distant. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't teenage moodiness. It was confusion. She didn't know how to talk to me anymore. And that only happens when someone else has already been talking on your behalf. Linda never accused me outright. Never said I was a bad father. That's not how she operated. She'd say things like, "Your dad works a lot. I'm sure he wants to be here. He just has other priorities." Or, "Well, I guess your father forgot about the recital. Don't be disappointed. It happens." Or, on the worst days, "That's just who your dad is." Each statement was a drop of acid, small enough not to raise alarms, corrosive enough to eat through steel over time. And it worked because Linda understood the power of passive suggestion. She didn't tell Samantha I was absent. She let her draw that conclusion on her own, planting seeds just deep enough to seem like independent thought. Meanwhile, I was still paying every bill on time, still showing up when allowed, still giving Samantha more than I gave myself. But none of that mattered. In Linda's world, facts were optional. Appearances were everything. To outsiders, she played the role of the struggling but strong single mom. She hosted school bake sales, volunteered for committees, organized Samantha's birthday parties with themed decorations and photo booths. And I was the ghost in the background. The father who meant well, but just wasn't there enough. The provider, but not the presence. She used phrases like currency. "You know your father doesn't really like crowds. He always forgets how sensitive you are. He probably thinks buying things makes up for being gone." And in the eyes of a child, those weren't accusations. They were explanations. Why ask why Dad missed the field trip when Mom already gave the reason? Why reach out when he clearly didn't care as much as she did? It was slow poison, the kind you don't even taste going down. One year, I bought Samantha a telescope for her birthday. She had been obsessed with space the last time we talked. I had it customized, engraved with her initials, and shipped directly to her house. Came back 3 weeks later in the same box, unopened. No note. No explanation. I called. Linda answered. Oh, that. Samantha's grown out of all that space stuff. I didn't want you to waste money. Did she say that? I asked. She didn't have to. I know my daughter. That's when I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a campaign. And like all good campaigns, it didn't need a villain. Just a convenient absence. Over the years, Samantha's view of me shifted in ways I couldn't trace. At first, I was the dad who worked too hard. Then I became the man who never came to school plays. Then I became the stranger who sent checks but never called. And finally, I became the problem. When Samantha turned 16, I offered to buy her first car. I told her to pick whatever she wanted within reason, and I'd handle the paperwork. A week later, I found out Linda had bought her a used sedan instead. When I asked why, Linda said, "We didn't want you to use gifts to make her feel obligated." Obligated. As if I were bribing my daughter for affection. That was Linda's genius. She turned generosity into manipulation, presence into guilt, love into leverage. And she never needed to yell. She had the truth in a chokehold before I ever realized it was being strangled. After Samantha left for college, I thought maybe the distance would help. That once she was on her own, she'd come to her own conclusions. That maybe she'd look at the bank statements, see who was really paying for things, and ask the questions Linda never wanted her to ask. But Linda was one step ahead. She told Samantha the tuition was covered through scholarships. She told her the apartment was funded by a small inheritance from her grandmother. She told her that all the support she was receiving came from careful planning, and not the man whose name had been removed from every record. And Samantha believed it, because why wouldn't she? Linda had been narrating the story her whole life, and I was just a background character in a book I had written but never got to read. The most painful part wasn't that I was erased. It was that I had helped make it so easy, because I'd never spoken against Linda, never contradicted her, never fought her stories with stories of my own. I believed silence was strength, that dignity meant taking the hits quietly. But all that did was leave Samantha with one voice in her head. And it wasn't mine. So by the time she met Ethan, smooth-talking, camera-ready Ethan, I had already lost. He didn't have to charm me. He didn't have to get my blessing. Because in her mind, I was no longer part of the equation. I was history, a distant figure. A man who mailed money but had long since walked out of her emotional life. Even the engagement announcement was wrapped in Linda's fingerprints. The post said, "Thanks to Mom for helping every step of the way." Mom. Not my parents. Not my family. Just Linda. And in the background of one photo, I spotted the edge of a wedding binder. The name on the front read, Avery Stanton, Elite Events. I recognized it immediately. Avery had once coordinated a gala for a shipping conference I attended. Professional, high-end, discreet. So I reached out, and that was the crack in the door. Because Avery didn't know the history. She only knew the budget. And when she saw my name linked to the trust that was funding the entire event, she was nothing but respectful. "Mr. Graves, I'll be forwarding you the vendor packages as they come in. We appreciate your generosity." I said nothing about the estrangement, just signed the forms, paid the deposits, reviewed the contracts. But I also noticed something odd in the planning documents. Linda had listed herself as mother of the bride and primary contact. There was no line for father of the bride, not even a mention. And when I asked Avery about it, she said, "I assumed that's what you wanted." Samantha said you weren't part of the celebration. That word again. Not invited. Not excluded. Just not part of it. As if I'd opted out of my own daughter's life. And that's when I knew. Linda hadn't just pushed me out. She had replaced me. In the narrative. In the planning. In Samantha's heart. and Samantha had let her. So I let the lie breathe. I let them plan the wedding. Let them bask in their illusion. But I put a leash on the payments. I tied every dollar to clauses they hadn't read. And I waited. Because sometimes, when someone burns down the bridge you built, the best revenge is letting them cross it one last time. Only to watch it vanish beneath their feet. Control isn't about yelling. It isn't about dominance or authority or proving you're the biggest presence in the room. Real control is quieter. It's in the paperwork no one reads. The email footnotes that slip past attention. The dotted lines people sign thinking they understand everything, when they've only read the first page. And when you've spent 3 decades building a business in logistics, you learn something valuable. The ones who hold the power aren't always the ones speaking. They're the ones with the contracts. I didn't come to my daughter's wedding planning with the goal of revenge. I came with precision. Let them have the illusion of independence. Let Linda spin her stories. Let Samantha post filtered photos of the dress fittings and say it's all thanks to Mom. Let Ethan think he's marrying into a woman with status and no strings. I'd funded companies more discreetly than this. Funding a wedding was easy. But this time I wasn't just writing checks. I was writing architecture. It started with the trust. Not just a personal account, but a layered financial structure with specific control parameters. A revocable trust, built in my name, registered through one of my holding companies. From the outside, it looked like a simple wedding fund. Inside, it was an unbreakable web. Each vendor contract was tied to that trust. No vendor was paid directly by Samantha or Linda. Every invoice passed through one person, me. And every agreement included a clause. It wasn't buried. It wasn't hidden in deceptive legalese. It was right there, line 37 in the vendor agreements, tucked between standard cancellation and rescheduling policies. All payments are conditional upon final event execution and at the discretion of the grantor. Simple, clean, lethal. To the casual eye, it meant nothing. But to those who understood contracts, it meant that if I chose to, at any moment, even on the day of the wedding, I could revoke payment, freeze accounts, and legally cancel every service. No questions asked. There were no loopholes, no fallback terms, no alternate payés, because no one thought to ask. Samantha didn't review the contracts. Linda skimmed, assuming she had the upper hand. Ethan signed whatever crossed his desk, smiling through it all, content with the illusion of wealth and perfection. And Avery, the planner, wasn't paid enough to ask the right questions. She followed the signatures, and the only one that really mattered was mine. Now, don't mistake this for premeditated sabotage. At first, I had no intention of using those clauses. When I signed those agreements, my hope, naive as it may have been, was that the gesture would melt the ice. That Samantha would reach out. That she'd see the man who had built everything beneath her feet and remember who he was. But silence has a way of sharpening intentions. And with each invoice I approved, I realized something. I wasn't being ignored. I was being erased, piece by piece. Each vendor I spoke to referred to Linda as the client. Each design note excluded me completely. Even Avery, who had originally addressed me with deference, began routing all questions to Linda after Samantha clarified that I was merely a financial contributor, not a stakeholder. Not a stakeholder. I paid for the stage, but I wasn't even allowed to sit in the audience. Fine. Let them build their castle. Let them plan the menu, the playlist, the speeches that wouldn't mention my name. I'd give them the grandest illusion of independence. And when the moment came, I'd remind them who made it all possible. The real brilliance of it all was how easy it was to disguise my hand. Every flower, paid via a floral boutique managed through a shell vendor I'd used for years in corporate events. The catering, routed through a culinary group that had served my companies at galas and annual reviews. The lighting and AV setup, installed by a team I had on retainer since 2016. Even the hotel ballroom, the crown jewel of the venue, was leased under a corporate discount I'd personally negotiated 5 years prior. They thought they were choosing luxury. In reality, they were walking through a maze I had designed before the proposal was ever made. I never told Samantha. I never warned her. Because warnings imply you want someone to change. I was done asking. This was no longer about hoping she'd see me. This was about making sure she'd feel me. Every inch of that wedding would be mine. Not in name, not in ego, but in quiet, total control. The illusion would hold. Until it didn't. But even then, I didn't pull the trigger right away. I still had the bracelet. Still had the gift. Still hoped she'd look up at some point, during the planning, during a tasting, during a fitting, and say, "Thanks, Dad." But she never did. She thanked Linda. She praised Ethan. She posted photo after photo of her self-made wedding. No one ever asks who pays for the stage when the lights are on. But when the power cuts, suddenly the name of the electrician matters. The wedding date was set, September 10th, a Saturday. 5:30 p.m. ceremony, followed by cocktails on the terrace. Then the grand reception at 7 p.m. I received the final invoice breakdown 1 week before. Total expenses, $123,800. Approved. Paid. But this time I added one final clause. A timed control protocol with my legal team. If triggered, all active payments, both pending and already cleared, would be legally frozen under a conditional event failure clause. They wouldn't just stop the checks. They would reverse any payments not yet fulfilled in physical services. And because of the trust structure, vendors couldn't legally go after Samantha, Linda, or Ethan for missed payments. They could only come to me, and I wouldn't be answering the phone. Still, I didn't plan to use it. Not until that moment. The moment at the wedding when Samantha turned, saw me and said it. "Dad, you're not invited. Go away." That's when everything clicked. I didn't belong. Not in her life. Not in her wedding. Not even as a shadow in the back row. And if I didn't belong, then neither did anything I gave. So I left. Quietly.
No confrontation.
No drama. And outside I sent one message. It was pre-written. Simple. Surgical. Execute freeze. Event ID 0910 Graves. Per trust clause, halt and reverse all payments. A confirmation pinged back. Within 15 minutes, everything that held the wedding together began to slide apart. Avery would receive the first call. The floral team, realizing payment hadn't cleared, would begin packing up. The AV team would cut power to anything not running on the hotel's backup systems. Caterers would stop serving. Bar service would halt. The band, unaware at first, would be mid-song when the plug was metaphorically pulled. Vendors don't work for free. Not in this economy. Not in that industry. I knew the moment it would all begin to unravel. Because I had pulled every string. They just hadn't felt it yet. But when they did, they'd remember me. Not with love. Not with gratitude. But with clarity. And that, in the end, was all I ever wanted. Ethan Ward had the kind of smile that made people trust him before he said a word. It wasn't just white teeth or dimples or charm, though he had all of those in excess. It was a posture, a presence, a calculated warmth. A handshake that lingered just long enough to make you feel chosen. Eye contact that implied understanding. Laughter delivered on cue. He was smooth, dangerously so. And from the moment I saw his engagement post with Samantha, I knew he was either the best thing to ever happen to her or the worst. But Samantha? She was enchanted. He said all the right things. Listened just long enough to make her feel heard. Bought her flowers just because. Showed up early, remembered names, laughed at her jokes like they were private secrets between them. He played the game with finesse. She met him at a networking event. He was doing a presentation on property scaling for upward mobility. Some glossy nonsense phrase that means nothing and sounds like everything. He wore a fitted suit, spoke without notes, and sprinkled his pitch with personal anecdotes and mild self-deprecation. A masterclass in performance. Samantha approached him after the talk. She never told me what she said, but I know my daughter. Driven, intelligent, but starved for affirmation. He saw it instantly. To a man like Ethan, a woman like Samantha is gold. Successful enough to raise his profile, hungry enough to ignore red flags, and surrounded by people who reinforce illusions. He moved fast. Within 3 months, they were inseparable. 6 months in, he moved into her condo. Said he wanted to simplify finances, that paying rent was dead capital. Samantha called me once during that time, not to talk, not to reconnect, but to ask if I thought buying property together before marriage was smart. I remember staring at the phone. Not a "how are you?" Not a "can we talk?" Just one cold, calculated question. As if I were some consultant she no longer respected but couldn't ignore completely. I gave her the best answer I could. If you trust him, get everything in writing. That's all I'll say. She thanked me and hung up. I knew it wouldn't be enough. Ethan was exactly the kind of man who floats to the top in social circles. People wanted to be around him, not because they knew him, but because he reflected the image they wanted for themselves. Linda adored him. Of course she did. He was everything she thought she deserved the first time around. Sharp-dressed, well-spoken, visibly successful. He even brought her expensive wine the first time they met. That was all it took. From that moment, he had a permanent seat at her table. She began referring to him as our future son-in-law before he even proposed. She introduced him at brunches, luncheons, fundraisers. She called him polished, ambitious, respectful. She never used those words for me. I watched from the sidelines as Ethan slid into Samantha's life like a well-cut suit, fitting perfectly, making everything look better on the outside, while concealing every flaw underneath. Still, I didn't interfere. I didn't confront him. Not then. Because interfering makes you the villain. Doubt makes you the threat. Especially when you've already been painted as the absentee father. The provider, not the protector. So instead, I did what I always do. I investigated. Not obsessively. Not with paranoia. Just efficiently. I had contacts. Business partners. Quiet resources. You don't spend decades in logistics without learning how to follow a paper trail. First, everything checked out. Ethan had a small real estate consultancy under his name, operated out of a shared workspace downtown, claimed to specialize in scalable rental portfolios. Buzzwords stacked on top of buzzwords. His credit history was decent. A few missed payments early in his 20s. Nothing glaring.
No bankruptcies. No lawsuits.
But the more I looked, the more inconsistencies I found. His company had no employees. His website was built using a cheap template, barely modified from its default. His clients were vague. No listed addresses, no testimonials, no invoices traceable to any real person. Then I found the bank statements. Not through illegal means. I didn't need to break the law. All I needed was a shared expense report he had submitted during venue planning, when he claimed he'd be covering the rehearsal dinner. The account he used? Linked to a business card with no registered credit backing. And the charge? Declined. Quietly but declined. He paid in cash that day. Smiled, made a joke about banks being slow, and brushed it off. But I took note, and I started digging deeper. Ethan wasn't broke. Not exactly. He was leveraged. He was running a shell of a company with multiple high-interest lines of credit and no consistent revenue. Everything about him was smoke and mirrors, leases, not assets, flash, not substance. He was building a life off appearances. And Samantha? She was the main pillar holding up the illusion. He was counting on her name, her stability, her ability to secure things he couldn't, apartments, loans, social access. She was his collateral. I didn't have concrete evidence of fraud. Not yet. But I'd seen this pattern before. Men like Ethan don't implode on their own. They just wait for the wind to shift and then pretend they were never holding the walls up in the first place. The question wasn't whether he was dangerous. The question was when he'd start pulling her down with him. Still, I didn't say anything. Because saying anything would make me the enemy again. I'd already lost the narrative. Any concern I voiced would be filtered through Linda's script. He's just jealous. He can't handle not being the center of attention. He's always trying to sabotage her happiness. So I waited, watched, and prepared. Because people like Ethan always slip eventually. They forget who's watching. And when they fall, they drag others down with them. But not this time. Not with Samantha. Not if I could help it. I added a clause to the wedding agreement. One that wasn't tied to vendors. It was linked to a secondary contract. The prenup. And yes, they signed one. Samantha insisted on it. Not because she doubted Ethan, but because she believed in fairness. In protecting what she built. But what she didn't know was that Ethan's legal advisor, the one who helped him review the contract, he wasn't Ethan's advisor. He was mine, a silent consultant, paid through a third party, just to observe and clarify terms. Ethan never read the full language. He skimmed, nodded, smiled for the notary, and in that document, buried in Section 12C, was the clause that would become her salvation. If Ethan was found to have misrepresented financial assets, engaged in fiscal deception, or leveraged her property for undisclosed ventures, the prenup would nullify itself retroactively, meaning no protection for him, no half of her condo, no shared accounts, no claim to anything she brought into the marriage. But she didn't know that yet. Not then, because the illusion still held. He still kissed her on the cheek, still called her my beautiful fiancée, still posted cute stories of their brunches and getaways. He even cried during the rehearsal dinner speech. Perfect performance. But performances have endings, and some curtains fall without applause, especially when the producer is sitting in the back row holding the script and the scissors. Rachel Harper had known Samantha since they were 5 years old. They met in a sandbox, shared their first scraped knees, practiced makeup together in 8th grade, and snuck out of sleepovers to spy on high school parties. They had sleepover code names and inside jokes that survived 3 decades. If Samantha was the flame, Rachel was the hand shielding it from the wind. But somewhere between childhood and wedding bells, Rachel realized she no longer recognized her best friend. Not completely. It started as early as the engagement. The way Samantha moved through planning meetings like a CEO, not a bride. How she snapped at caterers. How she micromanaged everything. Even the color of the cocktail napkins, with a tightness in her tone that made vendors flinch. Rachel tried to laugh it off at first, told herself it was stress, that all brides became tyrants under pressure. But it wasn't just the stress. It was something deeper, colder. Samantha had become rigid. Not just with decisions, but with people. Conversations became calculations. Emotions were measured. Even her laughter started sounding rehearsed. Rachel chalked it up to Linda's influence. She'd seen it for years, how Linda's presence warped a room. The perfectly timed critiques masked as compliments. The backhanded smiles. The pressure to look, act, and speak a certain way for your image. But there was something else. Someone else. Ethan. Rachel never liked him. She didn't say it out loud. Not to Samantha. Not to anyone. That would have gone over like a lit match in a fireworks factory. But from day one, Ethan had rubbed her the wrong way. He was too perfect, too polished. He complimented with precision, like every line had been focus tested in advance. And he remembered everything, but only the things that made him look good. He had a habit of touching the small of Samantha's back when she spoke, as if to remind her he was always right there. Rachel noticed how Samantha deferred to him more and more, how she stopped questioning his ideas, how she edited herself around him, smiled a little tighter, and dressed a little more like his Instagram exes with every passing month. But the moment that broke Rachel's silence came during the final dress fitting. It was supposed to be fun. Champagne, music, a private room filled with mirrors and silk. Instead, it was awkward. Samantha had barely looked at herself in the mirror. Linda had taken over the commentary. Ethan had dropped by to surprise her and immediately began criticizing the neckline. Too conservative, he said. Maybe something a little more modern. Samantha nodded. Rachel stared. She remembered a different girl. One who used to dress like a storm and laugh at anything too delicate. Now she stood still, like a mannequin waiting for approval. That night, after the others left, Rachel lingered behind. They sat on a couch beneath a large oval mirror. Samantha kicked off her heels and leaned back, eyes closed. "He's just nervous," she said, before Rachel could even ask. "I didn't say anything. You didn't have to." Rachel took a breath. "Are you happy, Sam?" A long pause. Then, "Of course I am." Rachel waited for more. None came, so she changed tactics. "Your dad called me," she said. Samantha opened her eyes. They didn't blink. "When?" "A few weeks ago. Asked if you were okay. Told me he missed you." Silence again. This one heavier. "He's not invited," Samantha said flatly. "I know, but he's still paying for everything." Samantha's jaw tightened. "It's complicated." "No," Rachel said. "It's not." Samantha looked away. Rachel pressed on. "He's your father, Sam. He's been trying. All these years. You don't know the whole story. I know he was at your ballet recital when your mom said he wasn't. I know he sent you letters every birthday until you told the post office to block them. I know he helped you get your first apartment when you thought it was some miracle discount." Samantha flinched. That last one she hadn't known. Rachel continued, gentler now. "I know he loves you. Quietly. Desperately. And you've been pretending he doesn't exist." Samantha stood up suddenly. "He left." "No," Rachel said. "Your mom told you he did, but he didn't. He was just pushed so far out that you couldn't see him anymore." Samantha turned away. "He's always trying to control things." Rachel rose too. "No, he's trying to protect you. There's a difference." Silence stretched. Then Samantha whispered, "He's not part of this. I don't want him there." Rachel didn't answer. She just left. And when she got home that night, she sat at her kitchen table, wrote a letter by hand, and drove to a mailbox across town. Just to make sure no one intercepted it. She didn't tell anyone. Not until later. Because what she wrote in that letter was simple but loaded. It said, "Thomas, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need you to know, you're not crazy. You're not alone. She's not seeing clearly, but I think someday she will. You didn't fail. You were erased. And some of us still see you. Rachel." When I received that letter, I didn't cry. I just folded it neatly and placed it inside the bracelet box. It was the first confirmation I wasn't imagining everything. That I wasn't the ghost in my own family story. Rachel became my quiet ally after that. She didn't say much. She didn't sabotage the wedding or leak secrets. She just watched. And what she saw, especially in those last few days, shook her. She saw Ethan take more control. Linda feeding Samantha lines. She saw Samantha retreat into herself. A woman in a wedding dress trying to convince everyone she had built this life by choice. And when the wedding day came, Rachel stood by her side, held her bouquet, smiled for the photos, but in her purse, she carried a second letter. And when the reception began to crumble, when the flowers started vanishing and the food stopped flowing, Rachel would be the only one who didn't panic. Because she already knew. The architect had returned, and his silence had finally expired. There's a myth people believe about fathers like me. That we're quiet because we're weak. That we give because we're desperate. That we accept rejection because we've run out of fight. But the truth is, some of us plan further ahead than anyone realizes. Not because we expect betrayal, but because we prepare for it. It had been 6 months before the wedding when I sat down with my attorney, Marcus Dane. We'd been working together for 15 years. Long enough for him to know when my silence meant something serious. He read the first draft of the new will without saying a word, flipping through the pages slowly, until he reached the addendum. Then he looked up. "Is this real?" "Yes. You know she's going to contest this, right?" "Only if she finds out what she lost." He leaned back in his chair. "You sure you want to go this route? I mean, this clause." "She gets everything," I said. "If she invites me to the wedding." Marcus squinted at the wording. "Full inheritance. Contingent upon the unconditional inclusion of the father in the wedding ceremony and reception. That's the language you want. It's simple. Clean. No loopholes. And if she doesn't invite you, she gets nothing." He raised an eyebrow. "All of it goes to Clara?" I nodded once. Marcus let out a slow exhale, the kind people do when they're walking a tightrope between professionalism and personal discomfort. You really think she'll leave you out completely? She already has. He didn't argue after that. Just signed. The new will was notarized, witnessed, and sealed. A quiet bomb, buried in legal language, set to detonate upon my death, unless one very specific condition was met. An invitation, not a phone call, not a letter, not a public apology, just an honest, open-handed invitation. All she had to do was ask me to be there, and it all would have gone to her. The company shares, the investments, the house, the insurance, the retirement funds, all of it. But if she didn't, every cent would pass to Clara, my second wife, the woman Samantha had never bothered to meet. Clara and I had married quietly 4 years prior. Not because we wanted it hidden, but because it seemed easier that way. Samantha hadn't returned my calls in years. There was no one left to explain it to. Clara never tried to insert herself into my old life. She never claimed space that didn't belong to her. But she watched from the sidelines with quiet grace, always ready to step back when Samantha came up in conversation. She's still angry, Clara would say. But she's not blind. One day she'll see. But time had proven otherwise. Samantha wasn't blind. She had just stopped looking. So the will became my line in the sand. If she could cut me out of the most important day of her life, she had no place in mine. Marcus called it poetic justice. I didn't see it that way. I saw it as balance. All her life I'd given without asking. Now, for the first time, I was asking for something simple in return. Presence. And when it didn't come, the clause activated like a switch. Clara didn't know the full terms of the will. She only knew it had been updated. She never asked for details. Never asked what she stood to gain. Because she didn't care. But Samantha? She never even knew there was something to gain. Not because I hid it. Because she never asked. That was the tragedy. It was all there for her, within reach. Everything she thought she'd built on her own had been supported by scaffolding I'd installed long before she realized she needed it. And the final gift, the ultimate gesture of love, the legacy a father leaves behind, was hers for the taking. All she had to do was see me, not forgive me, not love me, just see me. But she didn't, and so the will remained sealed, waiting. The irony was brutal. As she stood at her wedding, surrounded by people who praised her independence, her self-made success, her flawless execution, she had already lost her entire inheritance. And no one knew. Not Linda, who smirked through the reception as if she'd won some decades-old war. Not Ethan, who assumed he was marrying into a tidy fortune. And certainly not Samantha, who believed she had crafted a future out of pure willpower. But the future she'd rejected had already been erased from her name. And I had nothing left to offer her, except silence, the final payment, the part of the story no one would read until it was far too late. 1 month before the wedding, Marcus called me. She hasn't reached out.
No.
She still can. She won't. He paused. You're sure you want this to go through? Marcus, I've given her everything I could. And if she finds out later that she lost it all over an invitation, she won't find out from me. And that was the truth. I never intended to use the will as a weapon. It wasn't bait. It wasn't punishment. It was just the line. You can love someone with everything you have, but even the deepest well goes dry if no one draws from it. Samantha had built a world where I no longer existed. I was just following the blueprint. The day before the wedding, I reviewed the documents one last time. Everything was in order. The trust was funded. The inheritance structured. The succession locked. My signature was on every page. Not hers. There's a strange peace in finality. Knowing you've done everything you can, and that the rest is no longer your burden. I had loved her as much as any man could love his child. I still did. But love without acknowledgement becomes grief. And grief eventually becomes resolve. She had chosen a life without me. Now it would be one without anything I built. The morning of the wedding, I left the will on my desk. Clara saw it before I left. She didn't ask questions. Just kissed me on the cheek and said, "Whatever happens, she'll know one day." I didn't answer, because that's the part no one wants to admit. Sometimes they never do. Ethan signed the prenup with a smile on his face and a joke in his pocket. "I don't need any of your money, babe. Just you," he said, kissing Samantha's cheek in front of the notary. It was a performance, like everything else. He flipped through the document with casual detachment, pretending to read but mostly nodding at legal language he didn't understand. He asked a few questions, just enough to make it look like he was being responsible. But he didn't read it. Not really. He trusted the man who reviewed it for him, a quiet, sharp-eyed financial advisor named Grant Malden. What Ethan didn't know was that Grant wasn't who he thought he was. Grant worked for me. Not directly, of course. That would have been too obvious. I paid him through a silent partnership in a shell entity that managed risk analysis for high-net-worth individuals. Ethan assumed he was hiring a neutral expert, but he wasn't. He was hiring a scalpel I had already placed in the drawer months earlier. And with it, we cut the future wide open. The prenup had been Samantha's idea. She'd seen friends go through messy divorces. She believed in protecting what was hers, especially the apartment and business account she held from before the engagement. "I'm just being smart," she told Rachel during the planning process. But smart isn't enough when the other side is smarter. The document was written cleanly, generous even. Ethan would have access to shared property, for 401k growth after marriage, a modest joint savings plan. The kind of safety net most people would consider fair. But in Section 8, Financial Disclosures, lay the first clause. All disclosures regarding financial holdings, obligations, and revenue streams must be declared in full by both parties. Any failure to do so constitutes grounds for retroactive dissolution of contractual protections. Simple enough. But further down in the addendum, in the event of misrepresentation of net assets, income source manipulation, or unauthorized use of joint or private accounts, the signatory at fault forfeits claim to spousal support, asset sharing, and any co-owned ventures. Ethan signed it, no hesitation, because in his mind, misrepresentation didn't apply to him. What would Samantha find? Anyway, the fake consulting invoices? The private PayPal business donations labeled consulting services? The credit cards routed through business entities in other states? He thought he was too clever to be caught. But I wasn't looking to catch him then. I was laying the net. Because men like Ethan always believe they're smarter than everyone else. He didn't know that the condo he'd moved into under Samantha's name had been partially paid for with funds I arranged. He didn't know that her business account, which he occasionally borrowed from, was monitored under a financial risk umbrella I had access to. He didn't know that Grant was feeding me quarterly reports. Not because I wanted to control her finances, but because I knew sooner or later Ethan would reach too far. And when he did, that clause would turn from ink on paper into steel around his neck. The first red flag came 2 weeks before the wedding. A flag transaction showed up in the trust's financial audit. Ethan had used a linked joint account to fund a short-term investment, pulling $8,000 out with the expectation of flipping it via cryptocurrency. He didn't tell Samantha. The money reappeared in the account 3 days later. But the breach was recorded. Grant highlighted it and forwarded it to me.
No commentary.
No need for explanation. The file spoke for itself. I didn't respond. I didn't warn anyone. I didn't even confront Ethan. I just waited, because people like him always escalate. They don't make one mistake. They make the same mistake bigger and louder until someone finally slams the door. Ethan's second mistake came just 4 days before the wedding. A $5,300 transfer from Samantha's private savings to cover a vendor emergency that never existed. He labeled it deposit correction. She didn't notice. She was too focused on the table arrangements, the dress, the seating chart, too stressed to watch the banking app. But the records kept piling up, and Grant kept sending them. On the day of the wedding, that folder was 37 pages long, labeled E. Ward, Breach Risk Index, sitting quietly in a sealed envelope in my briefcase, just in case. He didn't see it coming. Of course not. He stood there at the altar, flashing that same magazine cover grin, shaking hands with guests like he'd won something. He held Samantha's hand tightly, possessively, whispering compliments that barely reached her ears but kept her smiling for the camera. If he had any idea what was coming, he didn't show it. Maybe he was too arrogant, or maybe he truly believed no one could touch him. Either way, the trap was set. And once the payments were frozen, once the lights dimmed and the vendors began to vanish like ghosts, he looked around, confused. Not concerned, just confused. Like a man whose card just got declined in front of a line of people, but still thinking he could charm his way out of it. He pulled out his phone, stepped away from the table, made a few calls, came back with a grin. But the grin faltered when the hotel manager approached, speaking softly but firmly. "Mr. Ward, I'm afraid there's an issue with the booking." Quiet pause. "I'm sure we can." "No, sir. You need to settle the balance now." That was the moment Ethan's facade cracked. Just for a second. But it was enough. Samantha noticed. She leaned in. "What's going on?"
Ethan liet, smoothly.
"Nothing, babe. Just a glitch. I'll handle it." But the temperature had shifted. The attention turned. And Ethan did not like being questioned. After the event, I forwarded the file to Marcus. He reviewed it, signed the document, notified the trust lawyer and Grant. The clause had been triggered. Retroactively, Ethan would be entitled to nothing. No access to shared accounts. No spousal claims. No joint property protections. And Samantha? She'd be shielded from everything he'd ever tried to take. She didn't know that yet. She wouldn't know for days. But the trap had closed. And Ethan Ward was now legally cut out of a marriage he had barely entered. Not by vengeance. By design. It was never about punishing him. It was about giving Samantha the same protection I had always offered her. Quietly, from the sidelines, without thanks. Because no matter how far she pushed me away, I was still her father. And even if she never said it, I was still the one holding the net. So when she fell, she wouldn't fall far. She just wouldn't know who caught her. Not until it was too late. The wedding began like any other spectacle of wealth and curated affection. The ballroom glowed under soft chandeliers. A string quartet played a warm rendition of Canon in D. Guests murmured appreciatively as they sipped champagne and admired the ice sculpture shaped like a pair of intertwined initials. S&E. Perfect symmetry. Perfect lighting. Perfect illusion. Samantha stood beneath the floral arch with her hands folded, veil resting lightly over her shoulders, her face a portrait of precision. Not joy, not excitement, just control. Rachel, the maid of honor, stood just behind her, bouquet in hand, trying to hide the tension in her jaw. She knew what no one else did. That Samantha's world had been balanced on a lie for years. And now, without knowing how or when, she could feel it beginning to tip. Ethan looked impeccable. Tailored tuxedo, polished shoes, watch gleaming under the lights. His smile was photo-perfect, but behind his eyes, something was off. He kept checking his phone. He wasn't nervous. Ethan didn't do nerves. He was annoyed, as if someone had dared to delay his moment. Linda floated through the crowd in her champagne-colored dress, radiating triumph. She greeted every guest like royalty, clasping hands with rehearsed warmth. Every so often, she'd glance toward Samantha and offer a proud, approving nod. This was her masterpiece, her daughter, her victory, and I wasn't there, at least not visibly. But Clara was. She had entered early, unrecognized. She wore a pale blue dress, understated but elegant, with her hair swept back. She didn't speak to anyone. She wasn't on the seating chart. But she sat quietly in the back corner of the ceremony room, near the emergency exit, her eyes fixed not on the couple, but on the edges of the room, watching, waiting. The ceremony itself was brief, efficient. Samantha spoke her vows with poise, but no tears. Ethan's voice shook a little, more from excitement than emotion. "I promise to build a future with you," he said, hand over his heart, eyes gleaming. It sounded like a campaign slogan. Applause followed the kiss. Flashbulbs snapped. The officiant declared them husband and wife, and the music swelled. And for exactly 2 hours, the illusion held. Guests clapped. Cocktails flowed. Waiters moved like dancers, weaving between tables with trays of hors d'oeuvres. Laughter filled the air. But beneath it all, the first fractures had already begun. It started with a delay. The DJ, set to begin light music for the cocktail hour, stood beside the console, frowning at his equipment. His assistant whispered something. The power had reset. A minor thing. But then came the message on his tablet. Payment authorization denied. He tried again. Same result. Nearby, the floral team began packing boxes. Guests watched, confused, as 2 assistants started removing centerpiece florals from the cocktail tables. Linda spotted them and stormed over. "What do you think you're doing?" The lead florist held up her phone. "Ma'am, our invoice hasn't cleared. We've been instructed to collect all unfulfilled inventory." "That's impossible," Linda snapped. The florist didn't argue. She simply resumed packing. By the time Samantha noticed something was wrong, 3 vendors had already begun extracting their services. She approached Avery, the planner, who was standing near the caterers, now frozen mid-setup. "Avery, what the hell is going on?" Avery's voice was tight, professional. "We're looking into it. It appears some payments haven't processed. Vendors are pulling out. I'm trying to get them back." "What do you mean they haven't processed?" "The money's already been paid." "It was," Avery said, "but it's been frozen." "How? Who can do that?" Avery hesitated. "The trust," she said finally. The payment trust initiated a freeze. Everything's paused. Samantha stared at her. "What trust?" Avery blinked. "Your father's trust. The one managing the disbursements. It's under his name." It hit her like a slap. Not loud, just sudden. "He still controls it?" "I assumed you knew. It was in the contract." Samantha's mouth opened, then closed. She had never read the contract. She had left that to Linda, who, at that very moment, was standing red-faced near the catering table, arguing with a man in a hotel uniform. Rachel stepped beside Samantha, hand light on her arm.
"Sam."
"Don't," Samantha said low. "Not now." But it was now. The band had arrived late due to traffic. They began setting up, completely unaware. But when they plugged into the venue's power grid, they found the audio line inactive. Another freeze. The hotel manager appeared, clipboard in hand, face tight. "I'm sorry, but until the venue balance is settled, we cannot continue hosting the event." Ethan, now rattled, stepped forward. "I'll transfer it now." "Sir," the manager said, "we've attempted to run the same card used for the rehearsal dinner. It was declined." Ethan's mouth twitched. "That's impossible." Samantha turned to him sharply. "What card?" Look, it was just temporary. I handled it. I just need to call the bank." But she was no longer listening. Guests began whispering. A few were already making for the exits, murmuring apologies, pretending they had early mornings. The sound of laughter vanished. The quartet, uncertain, began quietly packing instruments. Samantha stood in the center of the chaos, her dress pristine, her veil gently fluttering with the movement of bodies around her. She looked like a bride from a painting, frozen in time, but the paint was peeling. And she knew, without needing to ask, who had done this. Rachel didn't move. She didn't rush to comfort her. She didn't panic. She just waited, because she had known it was coming. And while she didn't want to see Samantha suffer, she had warned her, many times. And this was the consequence of ignoring someone who had built everything you stood on. Meanwhile, Clara slipped out the back, unseen, unaffected. But before she left, she handed a sealed envelope to the hotel concierge with a simple instruction. "For the bride, after the guests are gone." Inside that envelope was a breakdown of every vendor, every dollar, every clause, every signature, and a note in handwriting Samantha hadn't seen since she was 19. "Paid in full. For everything you don't remember, Dad. She would read that envelope in silence hours later. At home. Alone. After Ethan had gone off to fix things, and Linda had retreated into the safety of blame and bitterness. She would read it twice, and then she would cry for the first time in years. Not because she'd lost the wedding, but because she finally saw the man who had paid for it all, standing silently behind her life, holding it together with invisible hands, asking for nothing except to be there. And she'd thrown him out like a stranger. The first guests to leave were the ones with children. It's always that way. They're the ones with the easiest excuse. Early bedtime, school in the morning, long drive home. They slipped away with polite smiles and murmured apologies, stepping out into the late afternoon air just as the hotel staff began rolling away the champagne carts. Then came the older relatives, more hesitant, slower to rise from their chairs. They hovered near the dessert table, waiting for someone to explain what was happening. When no answers came, they followed quietly, purses in hand, tuxedo jackets folded over arms. No one made a scene. Not yet, because the collapse wasn't sudden. Came like frost, cold and creeping. One surface at a time. The florist had packed the last centerpiece by the time the staff wheeled away the cake. Not cut, not served, not even displayed. It sat in the kitchen like an orphaned promise. 7 tiers of fondant and sugar flowers, unclaimed and unpaid. The baker refused to bring it out without confirmation of payment. Samantha never knew her name, never knew the hours spent sculpting those layers. And now it was gone, boxed up, wheeled away, vanished. Next was the lighting crew. The ambient lights dimmed first, then the perimeter strobes. Finally, the monogrammed projection, S&E, glowing on the back wall, flickered and disappeared. One guest clapped, thinking it was part of the plan. It wasn't. A murmur ran through the room. Then Linda snapped. She stormed toward the hotel manager, heels clacking like hammers on marble. "This is unacceptable," she hissed. "Do you have any idea who I am?" The manager didn't flinch.
Imaware, Mom.
"And I'm very sorry, but the contract lists a different primary sponsor. Mr. Thomas Graves. The account under his trust has been frozen. Without authorization, we are required by policy to suspend all vendor activities." Linda's face turned a shade of red that clashed with her gown. "You're shutting down my daughter's wedding because of some technicality?" "No, ma'am," the manager said. "We're shutting it down because no one has paid." Avery, the planner, stood nearby, silent. Her tablet buzzed with messages. Vendors demanding answers. Deposits vanishing into hold statuses. Guests asking for clarification. She had planned political fundraisers, celebrity birthday parties, high-profile galas. But this was new. This was sabotage. And it was brilliant. Ethan was still pretending everything was fine. He huddled with his groomsmen, phone in hand, gesturing sharply. "We'll sort it. Just a delay. A glitch. Don't let anyone leave." But they were already leaving. The music was gone. The food was gone. The lights were dying. People don't stay at a party that stops looking like a party. And no one wanted to be the last one in a room that was quietly falling apart. Samantha stood near the dance floor, motionless. Her gown shimmered under the dimming lights, its beaded hem pooling at her feet. But her eyes were locked on nothing. She wasn't moving. She wasn't crying. She wasn't even angry. She was just absent. Rachel tried to approach.
Sam.
Samantha didn't look at her. Was it him? Rachel hesitated. Yes. Samantha nodded slowly, then whispered, "I told him to leave." And in that moment, Rachel knew. The weight had finally landed. Samantha wasn't confused anymore. She knew. Linda was still spinning, trying to rewrite the narrative in real time. She marched toward the DJ. "Play something upbeat. Distract them." "The system's down," he said flatly. "Then use your damn phone. Plug in a speaker." He stared at her, incredulous. "The speakers run on the same grid." She turned to Ethan. "Fix this." But Ethan was already in retreat mode. dialing numbers, his jacket off, his tie loosened. The shine was gone. The mask was slipping. Rachel stepped forward, voice calm but direct. "Ethan, how many times have you used Samantha's accounts?" He blinked. "What? You heard me. That's none of your business." "It's about to be." He looked to Samantha, but she didn't defend him, didn't even look at him. The hotel staff began clearing tables. Not with urgency, just professionalism. Plate here, a glass there, a silent procession of workers undoing the illusion, piece by piece. Guests watched with thin smiles, uncomfortable now. No more champagne, no more music, no more ceremony, just a beautiful room, unraveling. And in the center, a bride who looked like she had stopped breathing. Linda made one last attempt. She stood in front of Samantha, hands on her shoulders. "Sweetheart, this is just a misunderstanding. We can fix it. We'll call the bank, call the planner. This doesn't have to ruin your day." Samantha looked at her, eyes hollow. "You signed the contracts?" "What? With the vendors. You signed them, right?" "Yes, but did you read them?" Linda faltered. I delegated most of that. I assumed." "You assumed," Samantha said quietly, "that he wouldn't matter." And with those 6 words, Linda took a step back. Because she knew. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the party. It was about what they'd erased. And the man they'd erased it from. Outside, in the twilight, Clara sat in a car parked across the street. She had seen enough. She didn't need to be in the room to know the exact moment it happened. You could feel it from blocks away. The silence had changed. Not absence. Not stillness. Recognition. Someone had flipped the mirror around. And Samantha was finally looking. The hotel lobby buzzed with departures. Valets retrieved cars. Women in gowns slid into back seats. Men loosened collars. The wedding hashtag had already been hijacked by gossip and confusion. Back in the ballroom, only a handful of people remained. Samantha, Rachel, Ethan, Linda, a few lingering guests pretending to wait for rides. Rachel approached Samantha one last time. "Do you want me to call him?" Samantha didn't answer. She was staring at the envelope Rachel had handed her moments earlier. The one the concierge had passed along. Still unopened. Still sealed. But she held it like something fragile. Like it might explode. And in a way it already had. She turned to Rachel. "Was this always going to happen?" Rachel hesitated.
No.
"Not if you'd asked him to stay." Samantha looked down. And for the first time since she'd said, "Dad, you're not invited," she whispered, "I made a mistake." Rachel didn't say "I told you so." She just nodded. Because some lessons don't need to be underlined. Some collapses speak for themselves. And some fathers don't raise their voices. They just remove their hands. And watch what falls without them. There's a difference between losing something and having it taken away. Loss is chaotic, emotional, uncontrolled. But what happened in that hotel ballroom wasn't chaos. It was structure. It was law. It was control so absolute it didn't raise its voice. It just turned off the lights and let the silence do the rest. The ballroom now echoed like an abandoned cathedral. No music.
No laughter.
Just the soft shuffle of feet on tile and the low hum of overhead lights returning to their default setting. The air smelled faintly of roses and disappointment. The hotel manager returned with a slim leather folder in his hand, flanked by 2 other staff members. He approached Linda and Samantha. "I'm sorry," he said again, voice calm, "but we do have to discuss the financial responsibility of the event." Linda straightened. "We've already explained the payments are coming from a trust. There's just a glitch." "There's no glitch," he interrupted gently. "The trust has been legally frozen under Clause 12A of the fund agreement." Samantha's voice broke through like glass. "What does that mean?" The manager opened the folder and slid a printed page toward her. "It means that the funding entity, Thomas Graves, has exercised a full discretionary hold on all outgoing payments related to this event. All pending invoices are now in default, and previously issued payments have been legally revoked under the right of conditional event failure. Samantha stared at the page. It didn't feel real. It didn't feel possible. A frozen trust? Revoked payments? Conditional clause? She had never read the trust documents. She had let Linda handle it. She had told Avery to just take care of the money stuff. And now it was collapsing around her with the elegance of a guillotine. The florist returned. "I'm sorry," she said, her arms folded. "But we need to load the remaining pieces. Your planner has the invoice breakdown. I'll need you to sign off on the unpaid items or provide alternative payment today." Linda bristled. "You're not getting another cent out of us until this is fixed." The florist didn't argue. She just turned and began removing the final decorations from the arch. Ethan stepped forward now, his voice sharp and rising. "Okay, listen, let's stop pretending this is normal. You can't just take everything. This is a wedding. We have guests. We'll resolve this." But the hotel manager had heard enough. He turned slightly, opened his folder again, and pulled a second document. "I should let you know, Mr. Ward, that per the venue contract, if final payment is not rendered within 2 hours of initial default, we are obligated to initiate a formal event closure and property reset." "Property reset?" Ethan echoed. "That means," the manager said, "your access to the event space will be revoked, and all personal and rented items will be held in default seizure until a resolution is reached or law enforcement is involved." "Law enforcement?" Linda snapped. The manager didn't blink. "If necessary." By now, less than 15 people remained. Mostly family. Mostly watching. Rachel stood at the edge of the room, arms folded across her chest. Quiet. She wasn't enjoying any of this. But she wasn't surprised either. She had seen this coming the moment Samantha rejected her father at the door. She just hadn't known how deeply that rejection had been anticipated. How carefully it had been engineered. Ethan tried to take control again. He walked to Avery, who stood behind her display table, her tablet still open, the timeline of the evening now irrelevant. "You need to fix this," he said. "I can't," she replied calmly. The contracts were clear. The moment the trust was frozen, I lost authority to act on behalf of the event. "You're the planner." "Yes," she said, "and I advised your family to retain control of funding at the beginning. You declined." He pointed to Samantha. "She's the bride. Doesn't that mean anything?" "Not to the bank." Her answer landed like a slap. He turned to Samantha.
Sam.
"Say something." But Samantha didn't answer. She was holding the envelope now. Opened, read, refold, and reopened again. It contained the itemized receipt list of the entire wedding. $123,800. Every dollar accounted for. Every check signed by one name.
Tomas Graves.
And below it, on a small card with curved edges, was a handwritten message. "If you didn't want me there, I understand. But you were never alone. Not for a single step." She had read it 3 times already. She was on her 4th. And still, she couldn't find the breath to speak. Because she knew every vendor, every arrangement, every piece of this entire day had been built by the man she had sent away. The man she had dismissed at the front door without a hug. Without a second thought. Linda was unraveling now. She'd taken off her shoes. Her voice cracked as she tried to call the hotel's general manager. She had switched from rage to desperation. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, pacing. "We're being punished. This is personal. We'll sue." But the staff had stopped responding. The hotel had done this before. Not often. But enough to know the drill.
Vendor non-payment.
Legal hold. Event closure. It was clinical. Efficient. Just business. Nothing personal. Except, it was personal. To Samantha. Because now it wasn't just about the wedding. It was about everything. She sat down in the middle of the room, on the edge of the now empty head table, and let the veil fall from her hair. No one noticed. They were too busy scrambling. Linda arguing. Ethan calling. Rachel talking softly to the florist, trying to keep her calm. And Samantha sat, alone, completely, utterly alone. The guests were gone. The staff was gone. The illusions were gone. And all that was left was a dress she hadn't paid for, a man she didn't trust, and a father she had told to leave. 30 minutes later, the hotel began final closure procedures. They wheeled in carts, collected silverware. The kitchen locked its freezers. The AV system shut down completely, and the head server approached the remaining party.
I'm sorry.
We need you to vacate the ballroom. Linda tried again to protest. The server simply gestured to the document in her hand. Signed, stamped, and sealed. Event terminated. Access revoked. Samantha rose quietly. She didn't fight. She didn't cry. She walked toward the door like she was leaving a funeral. And in a way she didn't know yet what would happen next. Not with Ethan. Not with the vendors. Not with the legal storm now crawling toward her like a tide she could no longer outrun. But she knew what had already happened, and what was never coming back. She turned one last time, looked across the dimmed ballroom, and whispered to no one in particular. He paid for everything. Then she left. The doors closed behind her, and the silence resumed. The wedding was over. Not ended. Over.
No rises roun. No sparkle send-off.
No final dance under soft lights. Just a quiet exit down a hotel hallway that smelled like antiseptic and disappointment.
Samantha rode in silence beside Ethan.
He hadn't said a word in 12 minutes. His phone buzzed twice. He didn't answer. She stared out the passenger side window as the city lights slid past, blurred by the glass. Her makeup smudged in the reflection. The bracelet on her wrist, gifted by Linda, felt like a cuff now. Heavy. Hollow. She took it off and set it in her lap. Still no words from Ethan. What could he say? What apology would matter now? He had lied. About the accounts. The emergencies. The effortless control he claimed he had over his finances. But most of all, he'd lied about the kind of man he was. And Samantha? She had helped him do it. She'd stood there, dressed in white, wrapped in borrowed light, while the man who'd made that light possible was cast out like a thief. And now the party was gone. But worse than that, the silence had followed her home. She sat on the edge of her bed, veil discarded on the floor, dress unzipped and still clinging to her hips like a husk she hadn't shed. Ethan paced the apartment. Loud steps, loud sighs. He was calling someone, his friend Rob, maybe, or one of the groomsmen. She didn't care. Everything he said sounded like blame. This whole thing was rigged from the start. They're trying to make us look broke. We'll get the vendors back in line. I'll fix it. Fix it? How do you fix a foundation you never laid? How do you repair a structure that was never yours? She opened the envelope again. The one with the receipts. The list read like a confession. Venue? Paid. Catering? Paid. Music? Paid. Photography? Paid. Dress? Paid. Rings? Paid. Planner? Paid. All signed. All cleared. All withdrawn. By him. The man she'd told to leave. A folded note was still in the bottom. She hadn't read that part yet. Her hands shook slightly as she pulled it out. Different paper. Heavier. Not cardstock. Legal pad neatly torn. His handwriting. Tight. Precise.
Familiar. Sam.
I didn't want to ruin your day. I just wanted to be part of it. I didn't need a seat at the head table. I would have taken a chair by the kitchen. I just wanted to see you smile. To see what I helped build. I never expected a thank you. Just maybe a glance. A moment. But you looked at me like I was a stranger. So I left. Because if I'm not welcome in your joy, I won't hold up the weight of it anymore. Dad. Asterisk. She read it twice. Then again. By the fourth reading, she couldn't see the words anymore through the blur. But she wasn't crying. Not yet. She didn't have permission. Not until she heard his voice. It was buried in her phone. A single voicemail. 2 minutes and 12 seconds long. Left 3 days before the wedding. She had ignored the notification when it arrived. Too busy with cake samples and floral mock-ups. Now, she opened it with trembling fingers. Pressed play. and heard the voice she hadn't heard in nearly 5 years. Soft, calm, full of love, restrained like floodwater behind a dam. "Hey, sweetheart. I wasn't sure if I should call. I know we haven't spoken, and maybe that's my fault. Maybe I should have fought harder. I just didn't want to fight you. Not like I fought everything else. I wanted you to come to me. When you were ready." Pause. A long, careful breath. "I know I'm not invited. I saw the list. It's okay. I understand. I've made peace with it. I'm still proud of you. I still love you. And I'll still be there. Not to cause problems. Not to make a scene. I'll just be nearby. Watching. Like I always have." Another pause. She could hear the hum of his office in the background. The faint clink of his wedding ring tapping his desk. Something he used to do when he was nervous. "If you change your mind, I'll be outside. Just send someone. I'll come in. I'll sit in the back. I won't say a word. Just let me see you walk down the aisle." Then silence. Long, barely a breath. "I miss you, kid. Always have. Always will." Click. The message ended. And something inside her collapsed. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quietly. A fall that felt like sinking into her own skin and finding nothing there. She pulled her knees to her chest, pressed her forehead against her arms, and for the first time since childhood, she said the word, "Dad," and wept. Ethan didn't come in. He stayed in the other room, still on the phone, still angry, still posturing. Linda had called twice. Samantha ignored both. Rachel had texted, "I'm here if you want to talk. No judgment." But Samantha didn't respond, because nothing needed to be said. Everything that mattered had already been recorded, left like a gift, 3 days before she destroyed the man who gave it. She lay there in the dark, still in half a wedding dress, the phone clutched against her chest like a relic. There were no fireworks outside. No laughter. No pictures. Just the sound of her father's voice echoing in a room that suddenly felt too large. And the thought that would haunt her for years. He was there, and she sent him away. There's a moment in every train wreck where time slows down, where no one's sure if it's salvageable or simply over, where people hover between denial and acceptance, holding their breath, hoping for a rescue that's never coming. The wedding reception had become that moment. The ballroom wasn't empty, but it felt like it. Clusters of guests lingered near the exits, pretending to check their phones. Vendors moved like ghosts, silently disassembling the remains of a celebration that had collapsed without so much as a shout. The floral arch had been stripped, the dessert table dismantled. Even the DJ's console had been unplugged and wheeled out, like the heartbeat of the event had flatlined. And yet, no one spoke. Except Rachel. She didn't plan to. She'd never imagined being anything more than the maid of honor. Supportive, smiling, helpful, present but never center stage. But the silence had become unbearable. So she stood, and she walked toward the front, toward the microphone that still stood untouched, upright, forgotten. Samantha saw her move and didn't stop her. Linda didn't even notice. She was still pacing in the hallway, trying to find someone who would listen. Ethan saw her and froze, and Rachel, with trembling hands, picked up the mic, tapped it once to make sure it still worked, and then she spoke. No music behind her. No lighting quiz. Just a woman in a lavender dress, standing in the ruins of a lie, finally ready to tell the truth. "I wasn't going to say anything," she began, her voice soft but clear. "But I think it's time someone does." Every head turned. Some paused mid-exit. Others pretended to keep scrolling. But no one left, because when a story starts breaking, everyone wants to hear the first crack. "I've known Samantha for 25 years, Rachel said, glancing at the bride. "She's brilliant, stubborn, ambitious, and she's built something incredible. A beat. But she didn't build it alone." She let that sentence hang, and then continued. "Weddings are supposed to be about love, about honesty, about family. And today, a lot of that was missing. Not because things went wrong, but because someone was pushed out." People began whispering now, not in mockery, in awareness. Rachel pressed on. Some of you know Samantha hasn't spoken to her father in years. And maybe you think there's a good reason for that. Maybe you've heard a version of the story where he walked away, or didn't care, or only showed up when it was convenient. She paused. Then, that version isn't true. Gasped. A few audible intakes of breath. Samantha's posture stiffened, but she didn't speak. Rachel looked straight at her. Sam, I love you. But you need to hear this, everyone does. Your dad didn't walk away. He was pushed, slowly, quietly, over years. And you believed it, because it was easier than asking questions. Now the guests were listening. Phones lowered. Conversations stopped. Thomas Graves didn't miss your childhood. He paid for it. He didn't abandon you, he showed up until he wasn't allowed to. And today, this entire day, the dress, the venue, the flowers, the music, the staff that just walked out, all of it was funded by him. Samantha blinked. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Rachel took a breath. I saw him. I spoke to him. And do you know what he said? He didn't want revenge. He didn't want applause. He just wanted to sit in the back. To see you. To witness the woman he helped raise walk into her next chapter. Silence now. Absolute. Not even whispers. Rachel's voice lowered. Softer now. But we wouldn't let him. She looked at the crowd. Some of you watched him walk away today. Some of you saw him leave quietly, with a gift in his hand and a look on his face that none of us had the decency to acknowledge. Her voice cracked slightly. That man gave everything to this day. And all he asked in return was a seat. She turned back to Samantha. And you told him to go away. Samantha's breath hitched. One hand gripped the edge of her tablecloth. The other trembled against her thigh. Rachel didn't press further. She just said, I had to say something, because silence is what got us here. Then she placed the microphone down gently and walked back to her place beside Samantha. No one applauded. It wasn't that kind of speech. It wasn't designed for claps. It was a mirror, and everyone had seen themselves in it. Especially Samantha. She looked at Rachel, eyes wide and red, then down at the envelope again, as if hoping the words inside might change. But they didn't. They never would. She had made her choice, and Rachel had finally spoken the truth. The dominoes had all fallen now. There were no more lies left standing. Only the space where a father should have been. Ethan broke the silence with a scoff. That was a hell of a speech, he muttered. Are you done? Rachel turned her head. Are you? He stared. Excuse me? She leaned slightly toward him. Are you done pretending this was ever about love? Ethan's jaw flexed. Samantha looked at him then, and for the first time in days, maybe years, really looked. Not at the suit, not at the charm, not at the image, but at the man. And she said quietly, I think you should go. Ethan's face contorted. Not in anger, in something worse. Fear. He didn't argue. He just walked away. Fast. Because he'd seen the tides turn. And this time they weren't turning back. Rachel stayed beside Samantha until the room emptied again. She didn't say anything more. She didn't have to. The truth had already been told. Loud enough for everyone to hear. Even the one man who wasn't in the room. Especially him. The ballroom was empty now. Chairs pushed back. Tablecloths wrinkled. Stray flower petals scattered like confetti after a storm. The kind of quiet that only happens after something important has ended, not gently, but with a sudden snap. No music.
No guests. No celebration.
Only cleanup crews whispering instructions as they packed away a day that no longer belonged to anyone. And into that silence walked Thomas Graves.
No fanfare. No announcement.
No one held the door. He didn't need a key. The hotel manager had left the exit unlocked, just as requested. A courtesy extended not to the father of the bride, but to the man who had signed every invoice. He moved slowly through the room, taking in the wreckage. It wasn't a mess, not in the physical sense. The staff had done their job. Plates were stacked, decorations boxed, but the energy, the tension, still lingered, like a stain in the air. Thomas paused at the head table. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a single envelope, slightly larger than a standard letter, cream-colored, embossed with the word, receipt, in gold foil. Inside was a 12-page itemization of every cost from the wedding, compiled by the trust's financial coordinator and signed by the lead executor. Each page ended with a simple line, paid in full, TG. He placed the envelope neatly at the center of the table. Then beside it, something else. A photograph. Not new. Not staged. Just a picture of Samantha at 5 years old, sitting on his shoulders, both of them covered in ice cream, grinning wide on a summer afternoon. One of the last good days. He didn't tape it down. Didn't caption it. Just laid it next to the receipt. Proof of a time before erasure. A record of what had once been. He took a step back, and for a long, still moment he just looked at it. There had been no satisfaction in watching the collapse. He hadn't taken joy in it. He hadn't watched the live streams, hadn't checked social media, hadn't answered any of the calls that came after Rachel's speech. Because this wasn't about humiliation. It was about finality. You don't collapse a house out of spite. You collapse it because it no longer shelters you. And because the foundation had been hollow for years. He had simply removed his support. Everything else had fallen on its own. Thomas turned away from the table and walked toward the exit. Halfway there, he paused. The same florist who'd removed the centerpieces earlier was back, collecting vases. She glanced up, startled. "Oh, sir. I didn't realize anyone else was." "It's fine," he said quietly. She nodded once, unsure what to say. Then, glancing toward the envelope on the table, "They said you'd already paid for everything." "I did. And you're still here?" Thomas paused, considered her. "I just came to leave the last thing." She tilted her head. "What is it?" He looked at her. Not coldly, not warmly, just directly. "A receipt." Then he walked out. 10 minutes later, Samantha returned to the ballroom. She hadn't planned to, but something had pulled her there. The emptiness, the silence, or maybe just the knowledge that she hadn't really seen it. Not since it all fell apart. She stepped inside, alone.
No Val. No Hills.
No makeup. Just her. The hotel staff didn't stop her. The manager had left a note. "Room available for cleanup and closure until 10 p.m. Take your time." She stepped into the center and turned slowly, scanning the space like it was a dream she was waking up from. Then she saw the envelope. She moved toward it, sat in the chair she never got to use, and opened it. The itemized receipt was meticulous. Timestamps, contract codes, signed approvals, every table setting, every chair, every bite of food that never got served. The margins held no warmth, just precision. She flipped through page after page until she reached the last one. And there, above the signature line, "This wedding was built by Thomas Graves." She didn't cry, not this time, but her throat closed as she lifted the photo tucked behind the last sheet. She stared at it for a long time, not because she hadn't seen it before, but because she didn't remember that day. And now she wanted to, desperately. She folded the photo gently, as if it might crack, tucked it into her purse. Then she took the receipt and placed it back into the envelope. She didn't need to keep it. She already knew the cost, and it had nothing to do with the numbers. Outside, the air was cold. The sky had turned that steel blue shade that comes just before a fall storm. She stood beneath the awning, phone in her hand. Her thumb hovered over the screen. Dad voicemail 1. Still saved. Still there. She pressed play again. Listened. This time she didn't stop halfway. When it ended, she whispered to the empty street, "I wish I'd invited you." And the street said nothing back. Because this wasn't a movie. This was real. And sometimes, real doesn't give you the redemption you want. Just the clarity you never asked for. It rained the next morning. Soft at first, like the world was embarrassed to cry in public. Then heavier. By noon, it was washing the streets clean of everything that had clung to them from the day before. Rose petals, glitter, tire tracks, broken expectations. Samantha sat by the window of her apartment, hair pulled back, no makeup, a mug of untouched tea beside her. The wedding dress was still draped across the sofa. It looked like someone else's memory now. She'd spent the night replaying the voicemail, not on loop but every few hours, like a child checking for monsters, hoping they were still there, so she wouldn't feel crazy for being afraid. Each time she heard his voice, she felt another piece of the scaffolding inside her give way. He had never asked for much, just a moment, and she denied him the smallest act of inclusion. And in doing so, she triggered something much bigger than she'd ever understood. Not revenge, just release. And the bill had come due. Not just the wedding, but everything. 3 days later, Samantha received a letter. Mailed first class. No return address. But she recognized the handwriting immediately. Inside were 2 documents. The first, a copy of Thomas's revised will, bearing the date 6 months prior. The second, a letter. Not long, not angry, just final. I changed the will not because I wanted to punish you. I changed it because I needed to know if you still saw me. You didn't, so I left what I had to someone who does. You will always be my daughter. But love isn't an inheritance. It's an invitation. And I waited until the very last moment. Dad. She read it 5 times. And for the first time since the wedding, she didn't cry. She just folded the letter, tucked it into a folder, and began to realize what she had done. Not just to him, but to herself. She hadn't just removed her father from the wedding. She had removed herself from the part of her life where someone loved her without terms. And that kind of love, once gone, doesn't come back. Linda never took responsibility. She blamed the hotel, the planner, even Rachel. She never mentioned Thomas again. Ethan disappeared entirely, gone the next morning with a bag and a half-apology text. Samantha didn't respond. She let it end quietly, because she finally understood where quiet ends lead. A week later, Samantha sat in the park near her childhood home. The same park where the photo had been taken, the one of her on Thomas's shoulders, both of them laughing, unaware of all the years that would come between. She held the photo in her lap, not just looking at it, studying it, trying to remember what it felt like to believe that someone would always be there, no matter what. And somewhere else, miles away on a property tucked behind long driveways and tall hedges, Thomas sat with Clara.
No headlines.
No press.
No updates.
He was exactly where he'd always been, working, thinking, watching, still a father, just no longer waiting to be seen. To those watching from the outside, this story is about a ruined wedding. But that's not what it was. It was a receipt for years of silence, years of rejection, years of giving with no acknowledgement. And eventually, even the most giving hearts take inventory. They calculate the cost. And if no one comes to collect, they close the book. So if you're listening to this, and you're thinking about the people you've pushed away, silently, slowly, with the kind of distance that doesn't look like cruelty until it's irreversible, ask yourself, is there still time to fix it? Is there someone who gave you everything and just wanted to be invited? Because sometimes all it takes is one word, one seat at the table, one glance back, before they walk away for good. And when they do, they don't shout, they don't demand, they just cancel the payments and leave you with the full cost. Now it's your turn. Have you ever been erased from someone's life after giving them everything? Or have you cut someone out and wondered if they're still waiting at the door? Tell me, because stories like this don't just live in hotel ballrooms. They live in homes. They live in hearts. And sometimes they live in yours.